Kyle Harrison is a US Marine Corps veteran of the Iraq War. He was born and raised in Detroit in an area traditionally home to working-class families. From an early age, his parents always taught him that a successful life was the life of a hard-working laborer. But among these lessons were also prejudiced views, especially toward African Americans. As a child, Kyle often encountered rigid social norms that instructed him to avoid interacting with African American peers. Kyle Harrison is a US Marine Corps veteran of the Iraq War. He was born and raised in Detroit in an area traditionally home to working-class families. From an early age, he became familiar with the harsh reality of an industrial city, where factories and plants provided a stable income, but also created tension and class divisions. These prejudiced beliefs permeated his daily life, and school only reinforced this experience. He often felt like part of a higher group, which led to a latent hostility that was instilled by his parents and environment. Over time, these feelings became part of his worldview. After finishing school, Kyle made a decision that would change his life. He followed in the footsteps of his grandfather, a World War II veteran, and enlisted in the US Marine Corps. This service was meant to be a trial for him, a chance to prove his devotion to the country. In the military, his character was forged, and his views on life and the world around him began to shift. In the environment of military service, where survival depended on teamwork, prejudice and division became irrelevant. In the Iraq War, Kyle found himself in difficult situations where the lives of his fellow soldiers depended on his actions. He learned to work as part of a team, overcoming personal prejudices. The military left no room for discrimination, especially when saving a comrade's life was more important than any differences. It was in the war that Kyle first encountered people with whom he made no distinctions based on race or origin. While Kyle was away, the city of Detroit had undergone significant changes. His parents always taught him that a successful life was the life of a hard-working laborer, but among these lessons were also prejudiced views, especially toward African Americans. As a child, Kyle often encountered rigid social norms that instructed him to avoid interacting with African American peers. The military left no room for discrimination, especially when saving a comrade's life was more important than any differences. It was in the war that Kyle first encountered people with whom he made no distinctions based on race or origin. While Kyle was away, the city of Detroit had undergone significant changes. Economic decline and the closure of major factories had caused a substantial decrease in the cost of living in Detroit. Empty neighborhoods, once home to factory workers' families, were gradually filled by new residents, predominantly African American families from other parts of the city and nearby states. This internal migration was a natural process. Their appearance were seeking affordable where housing, traditional working class areas with predominantly white populations had many came from overcrowded areas in Chicago, now forming Cleveland. African American families brought their cost of living, opening small businesses for the working class, and setting up Kyle Harrison observed one could changes with growing housing for comparatively low prices. He remembered his childhood, filled with a hidden disdain for black peers, a sentiment instilled in him by family prejudices and his environment. This disdain manifested in small things. He would avoid group activities, find any excuse not to interact with black classmates, and sometimes even engage in bullying. Over time, the approval this of his evolved friends into a deeply ingrained sense of superiority. After school, Kyle Harrison decided to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather, who had served in World War II and enlisted in the Marine Corps. His character was shaped here, and his prejudices began to dissolve. Military life left no room for discrimination, especially when survival depended on the cohesion Kyle frequently found himself in situations where the lives of his comrades depended on his actions. This taught him to respect the strength, skill, and courage of others, regardless of their background. One such case occurred during an operation in a region controlled by insurgents. Kyle's unit found itself surrounded, and communication among the group with the base was Mike lost. Warren, a network security specialist and commander of the radar warfare unit. Mike, being a calm and thoughtful person, suggested a plan to restore communication and intercept enemy communications to identify their weaknesses. Kyle, assessing the situation, took on the responsibility of he devised a bold withdrawal plan that included a diversionary maneuver and the use of the natural terrain for concealment. When the evacuation began, Kyle personally covered the retreat of his comrades, risking his life under heavy fire. At one point, Mike, who had been working with equipment in a separate part of the camp, was cut hesitation off from the main group. Kyle returned for him. They barely managed to escape the fire zone, but thanks to the actions of Kyle and Mike, the entire unit safely made it out of the encirclement. This incident marked a turning point in their relationship. Mike Warren, who had previously seen Kyle as cold and withdrawn, began to view him as a reliable Kyle came leader. To respect Mike for his intelligence and professionalism. This helped him rethink many of his preconceived notions. When Kyle returned home, he faced a new challenge. Now, as he looked at the changing Detroit, he saw a threat in every step of the new residence, which only this feeling heightened his anxiety and made him more receptive to the propaganda of Wright, who offered simple, though false, explanations for what was happening. However, the propaganda of Wright and his group deliberately distorted this reality. They portrayed the natural internal migration as some sort of invasion, ignoring the fact that the new residents were just as much as citizens, simply forced to seek more affordable housing and new opportunities for a better life. Wright skillfully manipulated the fears and prejudices of his followers. At every meeting, he emphasized the changing racial makeup of the neighborhood, portraying natural internal migration as a threat. Any incident involving African Americans, even the smallest, was blown out of proportion. Minor thefts turned into a wave of crime, and ordinary domestic disputes were described Kyle not as only absorbed the distorted ideas that Wright propagated, but quickly rose through the ranks of the organization. His cruelty and cold-bloodedness earned him respect and fear among the group's members, making him the second in command. Kyle became not only a strategist but a leader, demonstrating by example his military experience combined with physical training made him almost the perfect soldier for the gang. Even before his army service, Kyle had actively practiced boxing and freestyle wrestling, which toughened him physically and mentally. He applied these skills not only in fights, but also in his military experience, combined with physical training, made him almost the perfect soldier for the gang. Even before his army service, Kyle had actively practiced boxing and freestyle wrestling, which toughened him physically and mentally. He applied these skills not only in fights, but also in the training sessions he conducted were harsh and merciless, turning participants into disciplined and well-prepared fighters. He taught them not only methods of intimidation, but also tactics for combat, patrolling, and psychological pressure on opponents. Soon, the group of simple street thugs transformed into an organized paramilitary force capable of acting in patrols and escalation and efficiently. The first patrols of Wright's group were not directly related to violence. They were more of a demonstration of power and control. The group members, dressed in black uniforms, slowly walked the streets of neighborhoods predominantly inhabited by African Americans. Their silent presence, piercing stares, and deliberate disregard for personal boundaries created an atmosphere. The tension quickly escalated into open violence after the first serious incident. One evening, Kyle, leading a patrol, took his men to a basketball court where a group of African-American young men were playing. His appearance was intentionally provocative. He stopped in the center of the court and gestured to show he was waiting for a reaction. Kyle and his men expected submission, demanding that the young men either leave the area or pay a fee. Among the players, for using there was one who wasn't afraid and decided to stand his ground. The young man openly protested, which irritated Kyle. Without wasting time, he approached his opponent and delivered a crushing blow, breaking his jaw. When the guy fell, Kyle, showing no remorse, ripped his belt off and tied it around his neck. Demonstrating complete disregard for life, he dragged him across the asphalt for several hundred meters, ignoring the screams of horror. The other players became victims of the gang. Kyle's subordinates beat them with fists and traumatic weapons, leaving behind injuries and blood. Those who could run fled, saving their lives. The basketball court turned into an arena of violence. After this incident, Kyle firmly established himself as the de facto leader of the gang. Wright, recognizing Kyle's strength and influence, stepped back into a secondary role, taking the official position of ideologist. The gang fully submitted to the new leader, and his methods inspired others to commit even more horrific acts of violence. Now, Kyle's power was absolute, and no one dared to challenge him. Kyle, with his natural charisma and military experience, completely transforms the gang's structure. It is no longer just a group of street thugs, but an organized, disciplined force. He introduces a strict hierarchy with clearly defined roles for each member. To enhance cohesion, Kyle holds regular meetings where he demonstrates his own cruelty. Kyle emphasizes the gang's mission, stressing that their goal is not only the protection of the white race, but also the restoration of traditional order to motivate his followers. He uses a narrative that portrays them as heroes or warriors fighting against the impending chaos. Although Kyle has taken control of the gang, Wright retains his position as the ideologist, which makes their partnership particularly dangerous. Wright organizes regular lectures, using pseudo-historical and pseudo-scientific arguments to justify racism. In these lectures, Wright speaks about the golden age of white America, supposedly destroyed by the migration of other races. He uses manipulative rhetoric to convince his audience that interracial relationships threaten the genetic and cultural purity of whites. The lectures are accompanied by videos and distribution of materials featuring racist Kyle and Wright understand that in order to consolidate their power, they must turn their followers into fanatical adherents of their ideology. Gang members are given slogans such as, "Foreigners threaten our future. Race mixing is the death of our nation. White power is the foundation of peace." These slogans come with specific instructions on how to behave during patrols, intimidate others, and spread hatred without risking personal harm. A cult of cruelty is implemented. Those who display exceptional aggression are promoted and become role models. The gang begins to operate according to pre-planned schemes, turning their patrols into acts of intimidation. Their actions become more organized. At night, they conduct raids in neighborhoods where African Americans live, leaving threats on doorways. They spread racist graffiti and distribute propaganda leaflets. Stores owned by African Americans become targets for vandalism and attacks. Special hatred is directed at mixed-race couples, who are considered race traitors. The most brutal methods are used against them, from threats to assaults. Under Kyle and Wright's leadership, gang members transform into fanatical executors of their ideology. Young people who previously joined the gang for a sense of belonging or protection are now fully absorbed into the ideas of racial superiority. The ideal of the great defender of the race is cultivated, and gang members strive to embody this ideal through their actions. Wright uses fear and pressure to suppress any doubts. Anyone who shows weakness or disagreement is publicly humiliated or expelled. The gang's actions begin to extend beyond their immediate neighborhood. They distribute leaflets with slogans and threats in other parts of the city. Anonymous accounts begin to appear on social media, spreading the ideas of Wright. African American families and mixed-race couples begin to face regular violence and intimidation. After a series of aggressive actions targeting the African American population of Detroit, internal tension within the gang increased. Kyle Collins, seeking to solidify his power, began to notice that some of his subordinates were starting to show signs of unease. Some began to question their actions, which was dangerous. In their brutal world, a lack of loyalty began to suspect that someone among his people might be collaborating with outside forces. His attention was particularly drawn to Mike Warren and other key figures who had recently started showing too much interest in the gang's behavior. Kyle realized the source of the leaks had to be one of his men, possibly connected to journalists. Using his connections and analytical mind, Kyle devised a plan. He began gathering information on his subordinates, observing their actions, and analyzing every word and movement. When he noticed suspicious signals from various members, Kyle decided to carry out a harsh test. One evening, in an abandoned warehouse, Kyle gathered all the gang members except for an emergency meeting. Was aware of the upcoming event. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew that their lives and the fate of the organization were at stake. Kyle emphasized the importance of trust and loyalty, then began asking questions that unsettled Mike. His incoherent answers and anxious demeanor confirmed Kyle's suspicions. Mike was apprehended. Lisa Vincent continued her game with Thomas Green, gradually earning his trust. She knew he was the key to exposing the gang and used his attachment to her to extract vital information. At first, their relationship seemed superficial. But over time, Lisa noticed Thomas's intelligence and charisma, and she grew attached to him despite his criminal past. Lisa knew she was playing with fire. Every moment with Thomas could be her last. Yet, his inner conflict was evident, and Lisa believed he might be different. One evening, after a nighttime stroll, Thomas confessed his fears about his criminal involvement and his connection to Kyle Collins. Lisa saw this as a turning point, torn between her growing feelings and her duty. Lisa received key evidence from her FBI agent brother, offering her the chance to become a key witness in the case. She realized she had to act despite the dangers. The collected evidence became crucial in planning the next steps to expose the gang's activities. A pivotal event occurred during one of the gang's operations. After several days of violence in an African-American neighborhood, tension was high. One gang member noticed a group of teenagers, including an African-American, and saw his presence as a threat. Without provocation, one gang member fired, killing the teenager. Murder caused outrage in the community and became a catalyst for protests and media coverage. For Kyle and his gang, it was seen as justice for their cause. However, for Lisa, it became a turning point. She immediately contacted her FBI brother with evidence of the murder, knowing it reflected the gang's deeply racist and violent ideology. From the teenager's death pressured law enforcement. Witnesses described the gang's violent methods, while Lisa provided critical evidence. Meanwhile, Kyle, enraged by the attention, suspected someone had betrayed him and intensified his efforts to find Lisa. She and her brother planned to take the investigation to the next level. After months of unprecedented efforts by Lisa Vincent and her team, the moment came when Collins' gang was exposed, and its leader and ideologist would stand trial. All the evidence collected by Lisa, her FBI agent brother, and witnesses was presented in court. The charges of terrorism, racist murders, and violence. The gang's crimes were exposed, and despite Collins and his followers' attempts to justify themselves, justice was relentless. Thomas Green found himself at the heart of the battle between his conscience and loyalty to the gang, making his story one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes in Lisa Vincent's investigation. As Lisa gathered evidence against Collins' gang, her relationship with Thomas became more complicated. He was a key figure, but increasingly realized his involvement was not only destroying his life, but also leading to violence and deaths of innocents. Thomas tried to break away, but leaving the gang would mean death. Lisa and Thomas spent a lot of time together, forming a strange, tense alliance. Despite seeing him as a criminal, Lisa grew attached to him. Thomas was different from others. He felt guilty and didn't share their racist ideologies. His inner conflict made him vulnerable, but also Thomas knew he couldn't leave the gang unscathed. When Collins began suspecting a traitor, Thomas became trapped. Everything he wanted, freedom from violence and racism, felt unreachable. His hesitation and worry drew suspicion, and Collins' scrutiny made him a potential target for betrayal. When Lisa gathered enough evidence and contacted the FBI, Thomas faced a critical choice: remain in the gang and struggle with his conscience, or expose it, risking his life. Lisa offered help, but her feelings complicated things. Thomas finally decided to cooperate, providing testimony that revealed the gang's internal structure, racist ideology, and violence. This sped up the arrests of Collins and Wright. However, Thomas faced severe consequences. Though alive, his criminal reputation was ruined. He was left with legal penalties and a social curse for betraying the gang's ideologist was found guilty of organizing a racist terrorist group and inciting crimes. His role in embedding racist ideas among gang members turned them into violent criminals. At trial, Wright denied the charges, claiming he was protecting the purity of neighborhoods, but the evidence was testified to how Wright manipulated people and directed them toward violence. His influence was central to the gang's actions. The court sentenced Wright to life in prison without parole, marking the end of his role as a symbol of hate ideology. His punishment was a strong signal against extremism. The gang leader was sentenced to death. He openly admitted organizing terrorism, murders, and racially motivated crimes. Despite justifying his actions as fighting for purity, his words did not sway the court. Collins was found guilty on all charges and sentenced. The trial of Collins and Wright was a landmark event for Detroit and the nation. Families of victims found some solace, and the teenager's death became a turning point. Society began serious discussions about combating racism and extremism, sending a strong message about the irreversible consequences of such actions. Whose investigation led to the gang's downfall, became a national hero. Despite enormous risks, she remained resolute in pursuing justice. Her efforts inspired many to fight against racism and extremist ideologies, proving that one person's determination could change the course of history.